It's a pleasure to welcome you to this, our third in a series of Urban Health Institute-sponsored seminars this past academic year focused on resilience. There is no one in the world whose name is synonymous with resilience as is that of Sir Michael Rutter. Professor Rutter is a professor of developmental psychopathology at King's College Institute of Psychiatry. He is a consultant and has been for the past 40 years at Maudsley Hospital. And I would say unquestionably is the preeminent researcher in the world on resilience. And his work has informed many of us in this room. His concepts have been work that many of us have used and built upon. His work has shown that child resilience is not just dependent on temperament or on intelligence or IQ or genes, but that a child's interactions with others, the context, the environments in which children grow and develop are what are at the core of resilience. His research, however, goes far beyond that. And I was commenting this morning to a group of faculty down in the East Baltimore campus that many of us have been in academia told that the secret to success is to focus, and then focus more narrowly and develop expertise at the head of a pin. Listen to Professor Rutter's focus. It includes resilience in relation to stress, developmental links between childhood and adult life, school and social institutions, reading difficulties, psychiatric genetics, genetic epidemiology, autism, neuropsychiatry, effects of deprivation on Romanian orphan adoptees, antisocial behavior. I'm sure there's more. One's reputation is not always built through building on a narrow lens. His publications include 40 books, over 300 peer-reviewed articles, 140 book chapters. That would even get you an appointment here. His teaching has been primarily at the postgraduate level with interdisciplinary seminars in child development and child psychiatry. He's received many prestigious awards, including the Helmut Horton Award that he received in 1997 for research in autism that made a difference in clinical practice, and the International Society for Autism Research Lifetime Achievement Award in 2002. One of the hallmarks of Professor Rutter's work is that it is theory-driven and application-focused. For so many in the practice world, not just in the research world, and when I talk about practice, I'm talking about pediatric practice, I'm talking about psychology, I'm talking about psychiatry, social work, and beyond. What we have learned from his work has been directly translated to clinical services and clinical care. He has led a major study into the effect of early severe institutional deprivation in Romanian children adopted in Britain. In the most recent phase, the young people and their families were followed up to age 15. It is because of his extraordinary contributions that he was elected into the Royal Society in 1987, and he was knighted in 1992. Sir Michael Rutter, it is a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. I must say I enjoyed the introduction more than the screaming technology that followed it. I was just thinking that It is now roughly 50 years since I first came to Johns Hopkins, when I came to meet with Leon Eisenberg, who became a very important mentor and later a close personal friend. So what I want to do this evening is to look at the concept of resilience, and to do so in a questioning way before moving on to consider some of the practical implications. So what does resilience mean? Well, it's usually defined in the ways that you see on the slide. That's to say, of a relative resistance to environmental risk experiences, or the overcoming of stress or adversity, or a relatively good outcome despite risk experiences, which are basically three different ways of saying much the same thing. But what we need to note is it is not just social competence, and it is not positive mental health. Both of those are perfectly legitimate concepts, but they're different for reasons that I hope will become apparent. Now, what is the background? Well, the background is that there is a universal finding of huge individual differences in people's responses to all kinds of environmental hazard. That's been shown in animal studies, in humans, in experimental ways, and in naturalistic studies. And as far as I know, there are no exceptions to that. Plus, the evidence of what has come to be called stealing effects, in which successful coping with stress or adversity can lead to improved functioning and increased resistance to stress or adversity. In other words, not just surviving okay, but of actually gaining from the experience. Now, this slide is simply illustrating this in terms of the follow-up that was mentioned in the introduction that we've been doing of individuals from profoundly depriving institutions in Romania who were subsequently adopted into UK families. And this is dealing with the findings at age 11 on IQ of those who came after at least 2 years of profoundly depriving care. And as you will see, some of them have superior intellectual functioning, some are functioning down in the retarded range, and there's a big bunch in the middle. I presented it in terms of IQ because it's just simply easier to illustrate this, but this heterogeneity we find in all the measures that we've looked at. Now, I need to get out of the way two methodological artifacts. Getting them out of the way simply because I don't want to spend time dealing with methodological issues, but we do need to be aware that apparent resilience may be simply a function of variations in risk exposure. And until that has been dealt with, you can't study resilience. The second is that apparent resilience may be a consequence of measuring too narrow a range of outcomes, so that the kids look okay on one measure, but on other measures they don't. The studies that I'll be talking about have dealt with that successfully, but there are many, many examples in the literature where that has not been the case. What about stealing effects? Well, here the evidential base is much smaller, but it's not non-existent. The first is the finding that experimental stress in animals leads to beneficial effects on the neuroendocrine system. So this was first shown by Gig-Levine at Stanford back in the 1950s, and what he was expecting to show is the opposite of what he found, but he's now sadly deceased, was an honest scientist. And what he found was that animals, these are rodents we're talking about, subject to physical stress, the physical stress being put in a centrifuge and whirling round, not a very nice experience, that they had a larger neuroendocrine system and a better functioning neuroendocrine system, so that when exposed to later stressors, rather than doing worse, they did better. So they had been strengthened. Repeated parachute jumping is the example I like because I'm afraid of heights, and therefore it sort of has meaning for me. Novices parachute jumping don't show any particular pattern before they take their first jump, other than the fact that they're highly aroused, and then they, the cortisol and noradrenaline and all the rest of it floods out. Experienced jumpers have a different pattern before they jump, of a more adaptive kind, which is in preparation. They don't show the same kind of surge, as it were. The medical example, of course, that everybody knows about is that exposure to infections leads to relative immunity. You do not develop immunity by being protected from infections. The practical example that is in my lifetime is the evacuation to the UK of the islanders from Tristan da Cunha following the volcano there. Now, there was no influenza, there was no measles, there was no dental caries, none of the sorts of things that we have, and they went down like ninepins. I don't mean they died, but they suffered these quite severely because they had not experienced it. And in a lesser degree, we see the same. Immunization, of course, is the intervention example, where a controlled exposure to a modified dose of the agent provides immunity. In the psychological arena, we found that the experience of happy separations in early childhood led to better adaptation to hospital admission. Now, hospital admission, of course, involves far more than a separation, but that is certainly one of the things that it did involve in the days we were doing our research, because that wasn't a time when parents were routinely allowed to come into hospital with their children. Experience in older children or adolescents of coping with family poverty, as seen in the California longitudinal studies during the time that prior to our present economic depression was known as the Great Depression, the next to Great Depression, I think we would now see it as, led to psychological strengths. Now, in children it did not. The children didn't find it easy to cope with all that went on, but many of the adolescents, as it were, took on the responsibilities, found that they could do well at it and quite enjoyed it, and were strengthened by the experience. So what leads to stealing effects? Well, we don't know, but trying to put together the bits and pieces of evidence, because that's about all that it is, physiological adaptation, parachute jumping, psychological habituation, the separations and hospital admission, the sense of self-efficacy, as in the Great Depression findings, the acquisition of effective coping strategies, which would go along with those too, and a cognitive redefinition of the experience. So those are not facts, those are ideas about how it may work, and this is actually by far and away the most neglected aspect of the resilience literature. So in as is my wont, I want to approach the topic in a questioning way, because I think that is the way of good science. So let me start by saying, is resilience just a fancy way of reinventing concepts of risk and protection? Well, no, it isn't, because risk and protection starts with a focus on variables and moves to outcomes with an implicit assumption that the impact of risk and protective factors will be broadly similar in everyone, and that outcomes will depend on the mix and balance between risk and protective influences. By contrast, resilience starts the opposite way around, with a recognition of the huge individual variation in people's responses to the same experiences, and considers outcomes with an assumption that an understanding of the mechanisms underlying that variation will cast light on the causal processes, and in so doing will have implications for intervention strategies with respect to both prevention and treatment. So they are, in effect, dealing with things from completely opposite way round. So does that mean then that we should reject the traditional study of risk and protective factors? Well, no, it can't do, because there is an abundance of evidence that much of the variance in outcomes is accounted for by the summative effects of risk and protective factors. But more importantly than that, because resilience is an interactive concept that can only be studied if there is a thorough measurement of risk and protective factors. That's to say, until you've got that quantified and sorted out, you can't study variations from that with respect to resilience. So, does the appreciation that resilience is an inference based on the evidence of an interaction mean that it can be adequately assessed through finding a statistically significant multiplicative interaction? Well, no, that's wrong too, because firstly, a statistical interaction requires variation in both variables. Well, why should that matter? Well, let's just think. If you did a study looking at phenylketonuria, you would not find a statistical interaction, because phenylketonuria is a metabolic disorder involved in an inability to handle phenylalanines in the diet. All normal diets include phenylalanines. So you have variation in the genetics, you have no variation in the environment. At a more ordinary level, you see the same thing in the resilience in relation to malaria. That malaria in areas where it is all-pervasive, you don't get a lot of variation in individuals in the extent to which they're bitten by the Anopheline mosquito. Or let's come down to US and UK. That individuals like myself who suffer from hay fever during the pollen season have a genetically influenced liability that is brought on by pollens. Now, there are geographical variations in pollens, but not much. So there is not much variation here. And in the same area of the UK, or for that matter the US, where pollens have a standard level, you still find some individuals who have hay fever and many who do not. And the second is because synergistic interactions may involve either an additive or a multiplicative interaction. It sounds a contradiction in terms, and it is really irritating to simple folk like me that additive is used in a totally misleading way, but it is. And an additive means a straight increase in risk. Multiplicative means it's on a logarithmic scale. And it can be either. There is no statistical answer as to which is correct. Those involved in biology favour a synergistic additive interaction because it fits in better with biological concepts. But the thing is, you need to think of both. Well, can resilience be measured directly as an observed trait rather than having to rely on an inference based on some kind of interaction, however assessed? That seems an awfully long way round. Why don't we just get on with it and develop a decent questionnaire or interview measure that does the trick? Well, I'm afraid the answer, yet again, is no, because it isn't a single quality. People may be resilient in relation to some sorts of hazards, but yet not others. Equally, they may be resilient in relation to some sorts of outcomes, but not others. In addition, because context may be crucial, people may be resilient at one time period in their life, but not at others. So it is not and cannot be a trait. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that there aren't some individuals who, on the whole, are more likely in many circumstances to show resilience and others who are more likely not to show it. But I am saying that nevertheless it is not a trait. So that will come out more clearly when we turn to the next topic, which is genetic influences on vulnerability resilience. Now, these are reflected in gene-environment interactions in relation to some environmental risk influence as investigated with respect to some psychopathological outcome. The G times E, i.e. the gene-environment interaction, relies on studying an environmental risk factor for which there is good evidence of substantial risk and that risk is environmentally mediated. That has to be done in advance of looking for G times E. And there must be heterogeneity in outcome. Now, starting point for the moment has to be the study of environmental risk, because until you have knowledge of individual genes that are involved with environmental susceptibility, that you can't start with the genes. That will change, and the point will come where it may be better to start with the genes, but we're not yet there. So I will turn to the Dunedin examples using slides that are so much shown that many, perhaps most of you, have seen these all before, but nevertheless, for the occasional one sitting in the back of the room somewhere, I will explain. What we have here is on the horizontal, child maltreatment, none, probable, severe, and on the vertical, a composite index of antisocial behavior. And if you analyze this in the usual way, there is no genetic main effect. There is a slight, but only very slight, environmental main effect, but a big interaction. So that if you look at the yellow line, which is those who have a high MAOA activity, it's not flat, but it's not moving very much with the degree of maltreatment. By contrast, the red line, those with low MAOA activity, there's a whopping effect. So you've got a large effect of child maltreatment in relation to antisocial behavior that is driven by that interaction. Now, The next slide, again from the Dunedin study, in which foolishly I got the colours the different way round, but perhaps you'll be tolerant of that. And now this is looking now still at maltreatment, but it is dealing with a different gene. So this is the serotonin transporter promoter gene, and the outcome shown on the vertical is depression. And what you see is that those who are homozygous for the long allele, so-called, there is no effect. That maltreatment, horrible though it is, at least so far as this outcome is concerned, does not have effect. By contrast, those with the yellow line, on the yellow line, who are homozygous for the short allele, there is a big effect. Again, no genetic main effect, a small environmental main effect, but a large interaction. So we move to the third example, which is now turning to stressful life events. So we're now moving to a different environmental hazard, and what you see is the same picture. I won't bore you by going through the explanation each time. And so here we have an interaction, same outcome, but different hazard. It's also different in timing, in that the life events are near the timing of the onset, whereas the child maltreatment is all early childhood. The last example is a different outcome. This is schizophrenia spectrum disorders, and dealing with the COMT gene and looking at the VAL-VAL variant. And what you see here is in those with adolescent use, there is a big effect. It is those with the VAL-VAL who are vulnerable to develop schizophrenia. The no adolescent use, i.e. those who used it only in adult life, you do not see that effect. And you might say, well, that's probably just an artifact of sampling, but although you can't study schizophrenia in animals, you can study the cognitive effects, and those are age affected in exactly the same way. So this is probably a valid biological finding. So what are the lessons? Well, in none of the three Dunedin study examples was there a significant main effect of genes. The importance of the genes was only shown through the demonstration of the interaction. Moreover, in each case, the G times E was specific to particular psychopathological outcomes. And the findings underlie the fact that there is not and cannot be a single universally applicable resilience trait. Just to spell that out a little bit further, the MAOA interaction for antisocial behaviour was totally non-existent in relation to the depression outcome. The serotonin transporter promoter was totally inactive in relation to antisocial behaviour. Now, obviously, I'm not arguing that it's entirely specific because most genes are pleiotropic in their effect, but it is relatively so. The implication of the G times E is that both the G and the E share the same causal pathophysiological pathway. Now, obviously, that has to be tested, and at the moment, it hasn't been tested in a way that enables one to draw a strong conclusion. But they certainly have to come together on pathways that are close together and may be the same. And hence, understanding that may tell one the mechanism for the environmental effect and the mechanism for the genetic effect. The genetic variant is neither a risk nor protective factor in itself. That is, it has no effect on psychopathology in the absence of the environmental risk factor. As is the way, the press wrote up the MAOA finding as having found the gene for violent crime, but it is not a gene for violent crime, and it's a total misunderstanding of the evidence. So let's put those findings on hold for the moment and turn to other lessons from the resilience findings. I've mentioned that resistance to environmental hazards may come from exposure to risk in controlled circumstances rather than avoidance of risk. I talked about the natural immunity to infections. I talked about Gig Levine's animal experiments. I talked about the California studies. I didn't actually talk about the treatment of phobias, but although there are many treatments that are effective in the treatment of phobias, the one thing you know that is likely to lead to a continuation of the phobia is avoiding it. You need to have some engagement with appropriate help to get over it. And the evidence on all of this is limited, and we do need to consider both physiological mediation and cognitive affective mediation. So there is a tendency in some quarters to want to jump to the physiology simply because you're dealing with genes. But that's a mistake. And we need to remind ourselves that brain and mind are involved, and that they are different facets of the same thing. We also need to remember that protection may come from circumstances that are either neutral or indeed even risky in the absence of the key environmental hazard. Now, the best known medical example by far is heterozygote sickle cell status and malaria. Sickle cell disease is not a good disease to have. It's a killer. But if you're a heterozygote and you live in an area where malaria is endemic, you are protected. Not wholly protected, but substantially protected, well documented. And so that would be an example of a risky feature which is actually protective in this circumstance. What is the psychological example? Well, adoption, I think, is the obvious one. Adoption is not in itself a good thing. We would not recommend that all children should be taken away from their biological parents and placed for adoption. I mean, that would be nutty, unethical, and all sorts of other bad things. But the point is that adoption probably carries slight risks because it's atypical. And atypicality in most societies carries slight risk. So it's not an unambiguously good thing to happen. However, if you are rescued from abuse and neglect, then adoption is powerfully helpful. So it's the key circumstance that is important. The third lesson is the protection may derive from what people do with stress and adversity. That is, the notion of resilience focuses attention on coping mechanisms, mental sets, and the operation of personal agency. In other words, it requires a move from a focus on external risks to a focus on how these are dealt with by the individual. It's a dynamic concept, and it's a one which places the emphasis on what the individual does. Resilience, therefore, as I was saying, unlike risk and protective approaches, forces attention on dynamic processes rather than static factors that act in summative fashion. Now, what are those dynamic processes? Well, they could be neurotransmitters, which may well be the case in the G times E examples. It may be neuroendocrine effects, as in stress adaptation, or it may be cognitive emotional mechanisms. So it's not that the process is of any one kind, but it is saying that it is a process, and it's the process we have to understand. Such cognitive emotional mechanisms may require qualitative methods, although quantitative, to generate hypotheses, although quantitative methods will be required to test the hypotheses generated. And the example I give here is Stuart Houser's 2006 study, in which he did a follow-up study of individuals who had had psychiatric inpatient care in adolescence, followed them up to find out what happened to them, and found, as one might expect, some did well, some did badly, and some in the middle. And so he then did a qualitative interviewing, ignoring the ones who had done badly on the grounds that we know a lot about bad outcomes. And so he contrasted those who had done averagely well against those who had done particularly well. And what he identified was three factors. One was personal agency and a concern to overcome adversity. If you like, an attitude of mind that they weren't going to sit back and let things happen to them. They were going to do something about it. And the example I would give is one that you probably aren't familiar with, although some of you may. There was a series on British TV some while ago which was looking at individuals from a boys' club in Brixton, just up the road from where I live, a very socially deprived area, and following up what happened to them. And some of them in adult life, they were seen at 7-year intervals. Some of them were homeless, and 2 were millionaires. And the millionaire, one of the millionaires, sent his children to Millbank, England's most expensive school, and also a very good school. But then his business went bankrupt, and he had a period, I think, of a couple of years out of a job, really absolutely on his backside. And at the time of the film, which I think was when he was aged 32, he was working as a railway cleaner. You can't get a much lower job than a railway cleaner. And at the interview he said, "I've come up once and I will come up again. You watch. I know that I can achieve. I have achieved once and I'm going to achieve again." I don't know what happened to him, but he spoke with conviction, and I would be willing, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, to wager he probably did come up. He got an attitude of mind that made it likely. The second was a self-reflective style, looking at it, as it were, at what was happening and saying, what am I doing that seems to be working? What am I doing that seems to be going wrong? And thinking about that as a way of thinking what to do next. And interestingly, a commitment to relationships. That's not quite as obvious as the first two in terms of problem solving, but reflects the fact that we are social animals. And social relationships are a crucially important part of our being, and that success in life has to include being able to cope with social relationships. Now, he was very clear, or he and his colleagues were very clear, this is not proved mechanisms, but what it was saying is, in your resilience research, using quantitative methods, these are the kind of things that are worth looking at to see whether they are acting. The fourth lesson is that protection may derive from circumstances long after the risk experience. In other words, resilience may sometimes reflect later recovery, not an initial failure to succumb. The evidence on turning point experiences in adult life, such as a supportive marriage, as shown by the Sampson and Laub study, or army service in particular circumstances from Glenn Elder's work, but also confirmed in Sampson and Laub's work. I do have to remind you that this was the time when the United States was not at war. Nobody was getting sent off to Iraq or Afghanistan, and I'm not suggesting that army service is a good thing in itself, but army service was a way out of deprivation because of the GI Bill, because of postponing marriage, and did have a protective effect. This slide illustrates a putting together of several longitudinal studies by my colleague Andrew Pickles, and this is looking at females, all of whom had shown delinquent behavior in adolescence. So this is the vertical, and what it's doing is comparing those where there was a lack of marital support over the period between childhood and adult life, where not only the delinquency tended to continue, but poor social functioning did too, as against those who had had marital support from a non-deviant partner, and their social functioning greatly improved and their crime went down. Interestingly, in Sampson and Laub's study, it didn't matter whether the partner was non-deviant. What mattered was that they had a supportive marriage. And so exactly how much the non-deviance comes into that remains an open question. So resilience notions convey optimism regarding the possibility of surviving adversity, and that is important. But is resilience limited? Well, it is limited because the sequelae may persist as a result of altered patterns of interpersonal interactions, or self-perpetuating changes in styles of behavior, biological programming effects on brain development, the effects of stress in damaging neural structure, persisting effects on the neuroendocrine system, and the establishment of negative mental sets and self-concepts. So that the example here I'm giving is from the study of Romanian adoptees once again, and what we have here is the vertical is the proportion of children with two or more impairments across different domains of functioning, and across the horizontal, the age when they left institutional care. So if we look at those who left institutional care under the age of 6 months, very few of them had problems, and indeed they did not have significantly more problems than a comparison group. So that basically they survived without sequelae, at least at a group level. But in the second half of the first year of life, it jumped up to about half the population, and it remained flat. There are ups and downs, as you can see, but none of those are statistically significant, and it's basically a flat line. So something went on during that second half of the first year that led to persistence. And I'm giving just one slide on that, but if you look at head circumference, you see much the same thing. That's to say, those who were under the age of 6 months, there's no effect on head circumference in the absence of malnutrition, or subnutrition rather, whereas after that, there's a whopping effect. The head circumference is down about 2.5 standard deviations. Not a trivial effect, a huge effect. So what is that that's gone on? Well, it has to be something that is part of the biology, but what aspect of the biology is not something that at the moment we know for sure. So let me try to bring all of this together by starting with a reminder of the points that I've made on the key implications for scientific understanding. Resistance to hazards may derive from controlled exposure. Resistance may derive from traits or circumstances that are either risky or neutral in the absence of the hazard. It may derive from physiological or psychological coping processes rather than external risk or protective factors. There may be delayed recovery, even in adult life, and resilience may be constrained by biological programming or the damaging effects of stress or adversity on neural structures. So let me jump from findings to some suggestions as to what this might mean in terms of policy and practice. So, as always, in going from science to practice and policy, we have to make a jump, and in doing so, you have to make judgments as to what we think the findings lead to. So, the first suggestion is that if you're focusing now on what happens before the adversity, good intelligence and scholastic achievement help, secure selective attachments help, multiple harmonious relationships help, a sense of self-efficacy, a range of social problem-solving skills, a positive social interactional style, and a flexible, adaptive approach to new situations. They're all things which have been studied mainly outside the field of resilience, but I put them here because they remind one that actually none of those are resilience targeted in a very obvious way. It's dealing with a set of phenomena which seem to help. But secondly, a provision of a range of adaptive experiences, opportunities to cope successfully with challenges or stresses within the individual's capacity. Challenges are normal. They're a normal part of biology, and that they're a good part of biology because you can learn from them. And this is something that in our study of successful secondary schools in London back in the 1970s came through quite strikingly, that the effective schools had provided a range of opportunities for exactly this. They did it in rather different ways, but that was there. An opportunity to succeed in a range of settings and circumstances. We're not just talking about families or schools or peer groups or community. All of those in their different ways are likely to be important for such experiences. So let's move now to what might you do at the time of the stress or adversity. Well, a dilution of its impact, a provision of alternative sources of support and relationships so that the work that John Clausen did half a century ago, looking when a parent is mentally ill, that he drew the conclusion, which is similar to what had been made by others, that focusing on accepting the life situation, but seeing what can the father do if it's the mother who's ill, or the mother do if the father is ill. What about grandparents? What about older siblings, aunts and uncles? So that dilutes the impact and provides alternative sources of support. Fostering social problem solving, self-efficacy, adaptive coping, recognizing that the adage of my granny, like many of yours grannies, is there ain't no such word as can't. And all situations, however terrible, there are things you can do to improve. Fostering a positive, adaptive, cognitive set. Thinking about it not in terms of what is terrible about it, but what little things are good. And avoidance of damaging coping strategies. There isn't one good coping strategy, but reliance on drugs or destructive anger or just giving up are all bad because they prevent you acting. What about after the experiences? Well, the features as before adversity and during adversity, but with the additional consideration of a focus of turning point experiences that provide new opportunities that involve a break with the negative aspects of the past, so that the Glenn Elder studies that I mentioned would give an example of that with those who entered the army, that provide a change of mental set, so that the sticking with the army experience for a moment, these are kids who dropped out of school, who thought school was a total waste of time, a miserable experience, and the sooner they were out of it, the better. But when education was provided through the GI Bill of an adult type, but learning the same sort of things, they saw this as an opportunity that they valued and wished to take advantage of. And a provision of improved coping strategies. It's, of course, a truism that all of us who are clinicians are used to, that in treatment or prevention, you get nowhere saying, stop that, that's bad for you. You get nowhere. What you've got to do is to say, well, let's look at an alternative way of dealing with things. What might you do? And that then begins to provide an alternative to turn to and improve coping strategies. So the summary then of the key resilience promoters: reduction of impact, reduction of negative chain reactions, increasing positive chain reactions, opening up opportunities, neutralizing experiences. I haven't really had a chance of talking about those, and positive cognitive processing of experiences, a recognition that there's no experience that you can't think about it in different ways, and that probably all of us are familiar with friends, family or colleagues who see promotion as awful. At last I've been found out. I can't live up to this. I can't cope with this. It's bad. I'm going to come unstuck. Others who say the promotion is a recognition of what I can do. By golly, I'm going to live up to it. It's the opportunity I've been waiting for. Same experience at an objective way, utterly different in terms of its subjective effect. What are the research implications? Well, because resilience is not a general quality representing a trait of the individual, research needs to focus on the processes underlying individual differences in response to environmental hazards, rather than resilience as an abstract entity. Because resilience in relation to adverse childhood experiences may stem from positive adult ones, it's necessary to adopt a life trajectory approach that considers turning points later. Thirdly, because of the importance of G times E, it will be necessary to combine psychosocial and biological research approaches and to use a diverse range of strategies, so that this might include the functional imaging of cognitive processing, it might include neuroendocrine studies, it might include investigation of mental sets and models, and it might include animal studies. And on the whole, these haven't been all put together, but we are dealing with human beings as a whole, and if we are interested in good functioning, we have to be willing to use a diverse range of strategies. There are two messages of hope. Firstly, some individuals do survive adversity and even may be strengthened by the experience, and the time frame of resilience is a long one. Experiences in adult life that provide a break from preceding disadvantage and which open up new opportunities can counter earlier adversities. And is that a non-biological notion? No, it's not at all. So that I've not been dealing with the effects on the brain. Tomorrow we may turn more to the effects of stress on the brain, but what is clear is from studies of all sorts of kinds, experiences that only begin in adult life can change the structure of the brain. The taxi driver example is the one that people tend to know about. London taxi drivers have to learn all routes all over London. It takes about 3 years for them to learn this. It's a remarkable feat. It means that taxi drivers know more about London than taxi drivers in any other city in the world know about the cities in which they work. And it is associated with changes in the posterior hippocampus. So that's not childhood. And we're dealing here with structure of the brain. Interestingly, Eleanor Maguire has gone on to see, is this a permanent change? And what she finds is that taxi drivers who've retired retain some of the changes in the hippocampus, but it's beginning to fade back. So it's very enduring, but it's not necessarily permanent. So there are two messages of caution. The first is that some adverse effects of early experiences may be difficult to reverse because they've resulted in some form of biological programming and or neural impairment. And secondly, which we need to give equal emphasis to, is that there are important areas of ignorance about resilience. We do know a lot, so it's not that there's nothing to go on, but we've got to be careful that we don't say, we know enough about resilience now to write a prescriptive program this is how you bring it about. No way. We have got ideas on what programs are likely to be helpful. We should go ahead with them and evaluate them. And I emphasize a need for a broadening of horizons on how resilience might be fostered. And this should include recognition of the fact that some experiences that are neither risky or protective in the absence of adversity may still be protective. Adoption is the example I gave. The broadening of horizons also needs to take on board the fact that most influences that counter adversity successfully involve many different facets. The role of a supportive marriage is one. A qualitative study, which I could have mentioned but didn't, that John Laub's interviewing of that sample showed that marriage was a very complicated affair. And it wasn't just a loving relationship, it involved many other things as well. The fifth is that the countering involves changes that combine effects at the individual, family, school and community levels. I don't mean you necessarily have to do all of that, but it is saying we've got to think broadly, and we've got to think not just what might be effective, but in what context do we have a way of having an input. And then, more controversially, it may be helpful to counter maladaptive, no, not controversial, it's the next one that is. It may be helpful to counter maladaptive coping responses, but it will usually be necessary to help individuals acquire alternative methods of coping, both emotionally and behaviourally. Societal influences, which I've not said really anything much about, but I need to emphasise, may be critical in ensuring that everyone has the opportunity to exercise responsibility and judgment and to achieve success in some area that brings rewards and recognition, and that both racial discrimination and housing policies may both work against some individuals in that connection. And because some environmental effects appear to be mediated by changes in neurotransmitter functions, pharmacological interventions might be useful, although this is yet to be demonstrated. Now, people don't like to think about treating stress effects through drugs. Why not get to the root of the matter and deal with the environment? But if we had drugs that actually made resilience more likely, why shouldn't we use them? We use drugs in a preventive way in internal medicine. So statins are used widely to deal with coronary artery disease risks, and they do so successfully, and they carry low risks. At the moment, as far as I know, there are no drugs that are both effective and carry low risks that we could use in this circumstance. So I'm not advocating this, I'm simply saying don't close your minds on the grounds that that would always be a bad thing to do. There are advances happening. They may, or they may not, lead to drugs that we should be using. So, my conclusion then is the phenomenon of resilience is both real and it's important. Its existence provides hope and promise, but we need to be realistic and humble in recognizing that we are only just beginning to understand how to make use of resilience findings in prevention and intervention. We should make use of that, get on and do it, but do so in a way in which we evaluate whether what we're doing works. And on that point, I will end.
that entrance. Well, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I guess as somebody who works on early childhood and early child health, one of the things that interests me is to hear you talk about trajectories and resilience. And I guess I'm missing whether there's a developmental trajectory that leads to resilience in later life. So in particular, I'm thinking about that you didn't say much about mothering and nurturing early in life, or about the development of self-regulation, and whether those mechanisms that are really interactive between infant and nurturing environment are related to the way you talk about resilience.
No, I didn't deal with early childhood specifically, but that is simply because I didn't deal with any age period specifically. Is early childhood more important than others? Well, it is in one important sense, but not in others. The sense in which it's not important is the notion that everything is determined in the early childhood period, and we know that is not true. But it does matter because it comes first, and that therefore habits, styles, attitudes, ways of dealing with things that are gained during that age period will carry forward, and if they're the right ones, will carry forward in a way that makes further good things more likely to happen. So yes, I'm not against motherhood, and I think that the early years are very important in setting forward good trajectories. Now those trajectories can be thrown off track. So the mistake came, I think, in the days when people felt that if you got the early years right, you can sit back, you don't need to do anything again. That is not the case, as you know well as I do. But equally, it would be a mistake to say, well, because kids do show resilience quite often, let's just wait for a while. Let's leave it till adolescence or even adult life. That would be a grave error. So the kind of relationship skills, the kind of social cognitive skills, the kind of problem-solving skills, and the kind of attitudes. I mean, I think the attitude of self-efficacy, that you grow up feeling, I can do these things, grow up with the feeling you can succeed, and I think that does make a real difference. And one sees it, if you like, most strikingly with musicians and sports people, who usually, the great ones, begin early, and it's not just that they practice for longer periods, that's certainly part of it, but they grow up feeling, I can do this, and I'm going to do it. So, yes, I'm with you.
I don't know how loud I'll have to speak without a microphone, but I'll try. Thank you so much for a really rich walk through a really important path that you've shown us. As you were talking about resilience, I was thinking, you brought to mind the foster care children in the United States, which there are about 500,000 on a day. And the fact that we can find an enormous example of resilience within that population. There's a young woman in, I think, Seattle, Washington, who is a graduate of foster care, is now a master's in social work, and has created a website called Foster Care Alumni of America. And it's a really, I've heard her speak. She came to a congressional hearing and gives one of the most marvelous examples I know of a survivor of the enormous pharmacotherapy, which is, as you know, is among the highest rates of utilization of psychotropic drugs currently in the United States. So her name is Misty Stensley, and for me, she's a real hero, and is already leading some of this revolution of children who have endured enormous stress in early life.
Yes, well, I think that's very true and very important. And this morning in earlier discussions, I was making the point that should learn from real life experiences reported by individuals and not just by research studies. Research studies are very important. It's my bread and butter, so I can hardly attack them. But there are moving accounts which give a personal view of how it felt and what they were trying to do. And I think some of those are really very informative.
Thank you, Professor Rutter, for an extremely enlightening talk. I wanted to ask a bit for your advice. We're in probably the richest country in the world, and we come from an extremely wealthy country. And yet, if you look around, we are beset by lots and lots of poverty. And we're in the midst of lots of cost cutting as our federal government is looking to programs such as an early nutrition program for our youngest citizens. And so those of us who are interested in child development and trying to promote resilience sometimes find ourselves either pitting one program against another, and that's a bit worrisome. So I guess, do you have advice, or how would you help us in these very wealthy countries think about how to deal with the issues of poverty? Because I don't think we're doing a very good job.
Well, I agree you're not, but neither are we in the UK. So, yes, I think a wake-up call to both the US and UK is needed. I mean, it is quite striking on international statistics that both these countries, relatively affluent, do very badly in all sorts of indices. In life expectancy. Now that's a surprise, but I've forgotten what number in the ranking US comes, but it's way down, as is UK. Teenage pregnancies, ditto. Those living on the breadline, ditto. It's so, why is this happening? Well, I don't know. Nobel Prizes would be given for less, but let me offer some suggestions. I mean, I think the first thing is to see this in terms of community responsibilities, and that means government responsibilities as well as local community ones. And in an individualistic society, that's not something that is seen as a good thing. That it should be those who deserve to survive do and come to the top, and those who don't fall and deserve to fall. Now, I think from a moral point of view, I find that offensive, I have to say, and so I would be against that view, irrespective. But when you come to think about it, it doesn't actually work either, in that it's not good for the community as a whole to have all that around us. So let's look at one of the things the United States does really spectacularly well at. What do you think I'm going to mention? Putting people in prison. You have, I think it's the second or third highest rate of imprisonment in the world. And so that has to tell you something. That's such a stupid way of dealing with things. I don't mean that, of course, it's never required, but there's good evidence that putting people in prison makes it more likely that they will commit crime afterwards. Why? Well, for two prominent reasons. The first is that they find it more difficult to get a job when they come out. Work, Rob Sampson would come to mind again. And because they're out of work, then they're likely to go back to stealing or whatever they were doing again. Secondly, by locking them up like that, it puts stress on family life, so many of the families break up. And the third is that the rates of drug taking in prisons is astronomically high, so that they are going to be exposed not only to a whole lot of bad habits of other kinds, but they're also exposed to drugs. So we should, I think, and the UK has gone the same wretched route. We need to recognise that we have to have that as a sanction. There are some people who are so dangerous to the community, they need to be locked up for the protection of the community. But as a general solution to crime, it's a poor one. And we've got to be thinking of other ways. And to come back to the message that I, and I'm sure all of you have said, you can't deal with that by saying stop putting people in prison unless you say start dealing with it in some alternative way that has a bit of a better chance of working.
You'll need to speak extremely loudly. That mic will only give feedback.
Thank you very much for the great debate. I have two questions. One concerns your research about what happens within 6 to 12 months. You mentioned that you see a dramatic change in the capacity to develop resilience, and I was wondering what your ideas are, why that, what happens, and how can parents help that or not. And the second is, you said that the athletes and the other people who achieve this have this naked attitude, and I was wondering what would be like some practical advice for how to promote that as teachers, educators, parents. How is it like making things challenging, or but up to what level then, or make it easier?
Well, I think that, coming back to our schools research, having a range of ways in which rewards can come. So I mentioned getting position of school prefect, monitor, or whatever terminology you use, success in sport, making sure that if the school has several sports, they compete, so that the person who would be the best soccer player, the best American football player, best runner, and so on, can't be, because those are going on at the same time. So there are opportunities for others to do that. And sort of thinking broadly like that. Also doing it in a way in which there are rewards that come on the basis of each of those individual things, rather than in terms of having a streaming where, as it were, all the goodies go to one group and another group doesn't get any of them. So distribution, and the example that in that connection, which I think is in a way the most telling, is that during World War II, which was a time in Britain of severe rationing and severe problems of multiple kinds, the health of children improved out of all recognition. Why? Well, because what you got in the way of food was what coupons you had to do it, not what you could afford to buy. And so, because it was evenly distributed, it actually improved health. That wasn't the only reason, but ensuring that a community perspective, rather than a market economy perspective, dominates when you're considering things like health, education, and so on, I think is really important. Now, your earlier question was saying what went on, as it were, during that period in the second half of the first year. I have no idea. But because of the findings on head circumference, clearly something biological was happening during that time. And I'm not suggesting that is usual with stress and adversity, because I think there isn't that narrow window with most stresses and adversities. I think it was a particular function of the really extraordinary deprivation existing in Romanian institutions. So we've got to be careful not to overgeneralize that, but we have to say there is a biological science challenge to sort out what happened then and what could be done to remedy it either in advance or later.
Thank you so much. This has been an incredibly stimulating